Okay, let's get started. I'm Dr. David Downing. I'm the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, and I'm sharing the podium here, the chairs, with Crystal Downing, coincidentally, the other co-director of the Wade Center. We're happy to be talking about the feisty friendship of C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers. I'm here partly because we're on the program today. In the larger sense, I am here in this space because of C.S. Lewis. I was raised in a conservative Christian home, and I got to an age where the answers I was hearing just weren't satisfying. And then I got to a little older. Not only did I feel I was getting the right answers, I wasn't even getting the right questions. So when I went off to Westmont College out in Santa Barbara, we have some friends who are very important members of the Westmont community. But I went there as a student and was reading Perelandra in a first-year course. And I suddenly said, oh, this is a much more expansive view of Christian faith than I'm used to, and much more aesthetically pleasing view of Christian faith. So from there I went on and read most of the Lewis's books. I read the Narnia Chronicles in 2 weeks, and then I was so sad when I finished the 7th one, I read them again the next 2 weeks. So within a month I'd read them all twice. So that's, I would say, my lifelong love of Lewis and his importance in my own spiritual journey is part of what made Crystal and I feel led to come join the wonderful staff here at the Marion Wade Center. We just came here a year ago this month in May. It started on July 1st, and we've had a wonderful ride. It's really been an enjoyable time.
Yeah, feel free to come on in. There's some seats here at the front for those of you in the back. As you have just heard, I am Crystal Downing, the co-director of the Wade Center, and the reason I'm here is because of him. He published his first book on C.S. Lewis while we were still living in Santa Barbara, and then once we both got teaching jobs in Pennsylvania, it was much easier for us to travel to the Wade to do research. So David was working on his second book, and he said, well, Crystal, why don't you join me and help me research for my book? And I said, well, I'm going to have my own writing project, thank you very much. And I just chose Dorothy Sayers because she was the only woman among our 7 authors. And I wanted to learn more about her. And what a joy it has been to learn of her. In her 1938 lecture called Are Women Human? She answers yes. I just saw a great example of how to challenge culture but keep Jesus at the center of the challenge. I am wearing slacks today because in her honor, because one of the things she argues in Our Women Human is that women should be allowed to wear slacks. It's hard to believe that in 1938 that was a controversial issue. I also would like to wear these pince-nez because in her early life, Sayers wore pince-nez, but if I keep them on too long, I start sounding like Darth Vader. Because it really is. Pince-nez means pinch the nose, and it does pinch the nose. I don't know how people wore these. So I'm going to leave those off. Rather than restricting my breath or spirit, Dorothy Sayers modeled for me effective ways to tell the world about salvation through Jesus Christ. And this is significant. When C.S. Lewis was asked to identify the most important influences on his spiritual life, he identified 4. 2 experts on mysticism, G.K. Chesterton and Dorothy Sayers. So we need to know more about Dorothy Sayers.
And they had quite an interesting correspondence. Today we're going to focus on how Lewis and Sayers can help us respond to people who criticize our style of evangelism, or they may even question our faith itself, or our intelligence, or our honesty for even being a person of faith.
This was a really big question for me when I went to grad school at the University of California in Santa Barbara. I had one student peer who said to me, because I did not hide my light under a bushel, and he just looked me in the eyes and said, Crystal, you're the only Christian I've ever met who's the least bit intelligent. And then I was at a reception after a big lecturer on campus, and a bunch of professors were standing around drinking their Chardonnay, and one of the religious studies professors was making dismissive comments about people who believe in God. And so once again, I don't hide my faith under a bushel. And so I said, well, I believe in God. I wasn't even talking about Jesus and the resurrection. I just said I believed in God. And I still remember, because he kind of swirled his glass and then said, my, aren't you an anachronism? How do we deal with arrogant skeptics? And this is as relevant a question today as when I went to grad school.
And church history does offer some helpful examples. In the 19th century, Harry Emerson Fosdick was preaching, and a heckler said, I don't believe in God. And Fosdick said, well, tell me about this God you don't believe in. Chances are I don't believe in him either. So I thought that was a pretty good response.
And when someone in the crowd told evangelist Billy Sunday that he thought his preaching was too emotive and too manipulative, he responded by saying, well, how do you preach the gospel? And the guy said, oh, I don't preach the gospel. And so Sunday responded, well, I guess I prefer the way I preach the gospel to the way you don't.
Lewis and Sayers, too, had their detractors. When Lewis was vilified in later life for his conservative views by a group of undergrads at Cambridge, he replied in print, their tone is too much that of personal resentment. They would rather wound the author than inform the reader. Criticism should diagnose and exhibit faults in the writing rather than heap abuse on the writer. Students' critics need to distinguish between a dispute and a quarrel. A man would much rather be called names than proven wrong. Lewis wrote this many years after being attacked in print, both as a popularizer and as evangelizer. So he said he was a regular pachyderm when it came to be personally abused. And we know what pachyderms, many of you are Wheaton graduates, correct? So pachyderm from your SATs. Mrs. Howell, do you have an answer to that? Any kind of thick-skinned animal like an elephant or a rhinoceros. So he was saying he was very thick-skinned when it came to criticism. Dorothy wasn't quite used to being abused, so she had a different response.
Well, but first, when Lewis was asked which texts he turned to for spiritual edification, he listed Dorothy Sayers' The Man Born to Be King as one of his favorite sources of inspiration. But like Lewis, Sayers had to learn how to deal with detractors. The unfortunate thing for her detractors were fellow Christians. When she was asked by BBC Radio in 1940 to write a series of 12 radio plays about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, she took the commission very seriously. She spent over a year rereading the Gospels, reading Bible commentaries, reading histories, including Josephus, and seriously wanted to communicate gospel truth in ways that people would understand it. So in December of 1941, they were ready to broadcast the fact that these plays were going to become on the air, so there was a press conference, and Sayers read snippets from one of her plays. And it turns out that she had some of her disciples speaking slang. Worse, some of it was American slang. Protesters mounted a campaign demanding these plays not go on air. Sayers held her ground, and they were started broadcasting right before Christmas in 1941, but as late as February 1942, a person accused her, and this is during the war, right? accused Dorothy Sayers of causing the fall of Singapore to the Japanese because these plays were broadcast. This was God's judgment. Ironically, because of this huge scandal, people writing letters to Winston Churchill, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, thousands tuned in to listen to the radio plays just to see what all the scandal was about. And what they got was the gospel message in language they could understand, rather than all these Christians saying, you have to use King James English. You know, that famous, I'm sure it's apocryphal, that famous statement, well, if King James was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. So, as Dorothy Sayers told C.S. Lewis, thousands of people write to say that they have been brought back to God, or had their faith renewed, or returned with eagerness to reading the Bible, due to these controversial broadcasts.
Of course, not all listeners were impressed with the broadcast. One, a fellow named L.T. Duff, wrote to Sayers a brutal letter. Dear Madam, I heard part of your radio play last night, but eventually switched it off in disgust that such drivel should be given over the air and that a person of your standing should write it. I can quite understand people of little education accepting and taking in things such as these, but you must have made research and inquiries into the actual so-called miracle. In view of your findings, I cannot understand why you should write a play based on a pack of lies. If you read the events upon which your play was based, you will no doubt feel heartily ashamed of yourself for being such a party to deceit. Yours faithfully, L.T. Duff.
How does one reply to such an arrogant and insulting letter? It's hard enough to accept constructive and tactful criticism. I speak from experience. But how do we respond when, as Christians, to ill-informed and mean-spirited criticism? Dorothy perhaps replied a little too quickly. L.T. Duff, Esquire, I am sorry that you should have sustained such a shock. Is this really the first time you have realized that a large number of educated persons profess Christian faith? Let me beg you not to agitate yourself too much. For a person of excitable disposition like yourself, it is extremely wearing to live in a constant state of virtuous indignation. Console yourself with despising us. Nothing is more soothing than to contemplate the folly and depravity of one's inferiors. Yours faithfully, Dorothy L. Sayers.
Apparently Sayers felt that she gave as good as she got, and that should be the end of the matter. But Mr. Duff replied the following week. Dear Madam, I was very pleased and also surprised to receive your letter. I actually did not think you would trouble to reply. I usually find that religious followers are quite content to sit smugly behind their Bibles and refuse to answer questions. Do you honestly believe in the virgin birth, the water turned to wine? That excitable person, L.T. Duff.
Again, Sayers replied in just a few days, this time in more measured tones. Dear sir, you complain the Christians do not usually reply to your attacks. Don't you think perhaps that they would do so if you addressed them with a little more courtesy? In your first letter to me, you accused me, a complete stranger who had offered you no personal provocation, of ignorance and dishonesty. I should not dream of using such ill manners to anybody, no matter how wrong I thought him. Had you expressed yourself with more civility, I might have answered you less tartly. She goes on to ask Mr. Duff if he had read any contemporary works of Christian apologetics.
To this came Duff's prompt reply. Dear Miss Sayers, I can see now that my accusations were wrong, and I apologize, for there is no doubt you have studied and read widely on the subject, and honestly believe in what you say. But do you still believe in miracles? It is something I cannot quite understand. I have not read many modern books of Christian apologetics. I should be glad to know what you recommend. Best wishes for Easter, L.T. Duff.
Sayers responded the following week. Many thanks for your letter. It was nice of you to apologize. It always makes for a better discussion if arguments are directed to the subject and not to the person. She went on for another 8 pages, attaching an annotated list of 24 books on the collapse of modern humanism and the limits of science, as well as books of Christian apologetics, including C.S. Lewis's broadcast talks, which we know as Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, which is the book of Lewis's she recommends more than any others. She really found that helpful for her. And she also recommended G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, all books we have in first editions here at the Wade. But perhaps feeling that she still hadn't made her case, Sayers wrote another long letter 3 days later to C.S. Lewis. She was a great admirer of Lewis's Screwtape letters, and her note to Lewis included a memo, and you remember Screwtape letters is about a junior devil writing to a senior devil, and the devils are giving advice to each other. Lewis actually got one letter from someone saying, I read Screwtape letters, but it seems to me that the advice is positively diabolical. Yeah, didn't quite get it. Sayers got it, and she then parodied it by including a memo from a senior devil that she made up named Sluckdrib. So she's sending this to C.S. Lewis.
Okay, so this is Sluckdrib. He refers to his patient, the author of Man to Word to be King, and so he calls Dorothy Sayers his patient. So Sluckdrib says, we knew, of course, that the author is as corrupt as a rotten cheese. Why has no one taken to see that this corruption, which must surely permeate the whole work, has its proper effect upon the listeners? Either the enemy, that's God, of course, is really able to turn thorns into grapes and thistles into figs, or as I prefer to believe, there is mismanagement somewhere. Sluckdrib goes on to give this example, which is obviously L.T. Duff. A sound atheist of the old-fashioned materialist kind wrote to my patient a highly offensive letter about miracles, accusing her of ignorance and dishonesty in the vulgarest language. I persuaded her to answer it still more rudely and defensively. This should have inflamed the situation. Instead, the man seemed pleased to be taken notice of. His subsequent letters, though still discourteous and infidel, became more moderate in tone, and his latest effusion contained an apology and expressed some readiness to read some Christian literature if my patient would send him a list. This I could not prevent her from doing, though I saw to it that her motive was mere pride and self-sufficiency, not in the least contaminated by love for the atheist or interest in saving his moth-eaten soul. What is so sinister in his growing goodwill, which is beginning to affect my patient, and is the disgustingly false impression made on his mind by the correspondence? He actually thanked my patient for troubling to be insolent to him. He thinks better of Christians because she treated him like dirt and gave him a harsh answer. He does not see the meanness of her motives, which would make a cat sick. And anyhow, I must admit that the enemy can, as he claims, turn evil into good. This is just one of his propaganda boasts. It doesn't make sense. If he did, what are we devils for?
So then, along with this memo from Sluckdrib, Sayers included a note in her own hand, and this is what she wrote to Lewis. Thus says my attendant, meanwhile, I am left with the atheist on my hands. I do not want him. I have no use for him. I have no missionary zeal at all. The man keeps on bothering about miracles. He can't spell and has a mind like a junk shop. If he reads any of the books I recommended, he will write me long and disorderly letters about them. It will go on for years. I cannot bear it. 2 of the books I recommended are yours. I only hope they will arouse him to fury. Then I will hand him on to you. You like souls. I don't. God is simply taking advantage of the fact that I can't stand intellectual chaos, and it isn't fair. Anyhow, there aren't any up-to-date books about miracles. Please tell me what to do with this relic of the Darwinian age who is wasting my time, sapping my energies, and destroying my soul. Yours indignantly, Dorothy L. Sayers.
So Lewis wrote back to Sayers 4 days later, I'm starting a book on miracles. So this L.T. Duff did not know that I'm starting a book on miracles. Though it took 4 more years for the book to appear in print, it is clear that Lewis understood from the outset what Mr. Duff's problem was. On the first page of the book, Lewis explains, what we learn from experience depends upon the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. It is therefore useless to appeal to experience before we have settled, as well as we can, the philosophical question. As Lewis concludes in the opening chapter of Miracles, to those who assume that miracles cannot happen, those who assume miracles cannot happen are wasting their time by looking into the text. We know in advance what results they will find, for they have begun by begging the question.
It's not known whether Mr. Duff ever read any of Lewis's books, but it is known that despite her protestations, Sayers continued corresponding with Duff, including another closely reasoned 8-page missive. It may also be assumed that God can use even an ill-mannered atheist with a moth-eaten soul to inspire miracles, at least the book, one of the most influential works of Christian apologetics in the past century.
In fact, Lewis was so committed to Christian apologetics that in 1946 he tried to recruit Sayers to write a book for the Library of Christian Knowledge for Young People in School, it was called.
She, however, replied that her conscience prevented her from writing merely to edify others.
Lewis responded, I wish I knew what place artistic consciences will have a moment after death. Zing! You write such excellent letters that if I were a bad man, I should lure you into an epistolary controversy, and you would find you had written a book for us without knowing it. I should simply publish the letters.
This did not comfort Sayers. She wrote back a letter that begins exactly this way. Oi, oi, I see I must willy-nilly write you another letter. I've always realized that you were bothered about this business of art and edification, but I don't believe God is such a twister as you make out. I don't believe God implants a love of good workmanship merely as a trap for one to walk into. I don't somehow fancy showing a lot of stuff to the carpenter's son one day and saying, well, I admit that the wood was green and the joints untrue and the glue bad, but it was all church furniture.
Now, Lewis is getting a little bit feisty. Of course, one mustn't do dishonest work, but you seem to take it as a criterion of honest work, the sensible desire to write, the itch. This seems to me precious like making being in love the only reason for going on with a marriage.
This didn't help. I do not care for these sexual analogies of yours. But if you must have the thing in terms of love and marriage, then the position is that, having deliberately thrown the girl at my head and done your best to compromise us, you are now trying to force us into marriage to please the county, regardless of the fact that she makes my flesh creep and that I have been engaged for years to another woman.
So Lewis responds with words seen nowhere else in his correspondence. The opening lines of his letter are, hey, whoa! He goes on, you write as if I'd been urging you to do a book. Surely I was careful not to. The only difference I see is nothing but doubts where all seems self-evident to you. Then Lewis proceeds with his typical gracious humility. That may well be because you're a real writer and I'm only a half-timer. Don't bother your head about my views or doubts anymore.
Now this one got to her. She regretfully answers, I apologize for having gotten so hot. And then she writes a meaty letter saying, in your prophetic moments, and she's speaking to Lewis, you are with me as when the corrupt artist in the great divorce is in hell because he's a corrupt artist. He has turned from serving the work by making the work serve him. This is key to Sayre's view of art. Rather than write to impose propaganda on people, she believed that Christian creativity, including creative apologetics, follows the leading of God, who created the heavens and earth and saw that creation itself was good. It is in this letter that Sayers explains, because she refused to merely give people what they wanted in Man Born to Be King, and what they wanted was King James English, that thousands came to Christ.
This is the passion they shared, using their God-given creativity to bring as many people to Christ as possible. Their shared belief in the power of imagination aligned them in another way. Both loved Dante's imaginative construction of hell, purgatory, and heaven in his Divine Comedy.
Sayers, in fact, taught herself how to read medieval Italian in order to be able to read Dante in the original. And this led to a contract with Penguin Books for her to translate the Divine Comedy into English. After finishing translating his first book, The Inferno, Sayers wrote C.S. Lewis, saying the second book, Purgatorio, is far more difficult to translate because of its shattering simplicity. You can't fake it, and any acrobatics of rhyme and syntax show up like lipstick on a Madonna. But then she suddenly transitions into personal information. I have purchased 2 hens. In their habits, they display respectfully sense and sensibility. Both Lewis and Sayers loved Jane Austen, so this was something they shared. I have therefore named them Eleanor and Marianne, who are the protagonists. Eleanor is a round, comfortable, mothering-looking like body who lays one steady, regular, undistinguished egg per day and allows nothing to disturb her equanimity. Marianne is leggier, timid, and liable to hysterics. Sometimes she lays a shellless egg, sometimes a double yolk, sometimes no egg at all. On the days when she lays no egg, she nevertheless goes and sits in the nest for the usual time and seems to imagine that nothing more is required of her. But you cannot wish to listen to this cackle.
And the next time Lewis replied, he said, I loved hearing about Eleanor and Marianne. You are a real letter writer. I am not. So they had a very lively correspondence. I think the interesting arc of this exchange of letters is how God could take a seemingly unpromising situation and turn it into what's going to be a classic of Christian apologetics. Hence, what began in spite with Mr. Duff and in disagreement with Mr. Lewis ended in grace, a result that would not have surprised Sayers at all. She was keenly aware of God's ability to turn human failure into divine victory, as she concludes in her essay, The Triumph of Easter.
God did not abolish the fact of evil. He transformed it. He did not stop the crucifixion. He rose from the dead. As for the disciples' part in the drama, nothing could alter the fact that they had been stupid, cowardly, faithless, and in many ways, singularly unhelpful. But they did not allow any morbid and egotistical regret to inhibit their joyful activities in the future. They had misunderstood practically everything Christ had ever said to them. But no matter. The thing made sense at last, and the meaning was far beyond anything they had dreamed. They had expected defeat and beheld victory. They had expected an earthly Messiah, and they beheld the soul of eternity.
May we all go and do likewise. That's in the front. Drop curtain.
We have time for questions now, and because we're recording, wait until you get the mic for the question.
Hi. A comment and a question. My comment is, if you can't stand the pince nez, why don't you try a monocle in honor of Lord Peter?
Oh, I think that would be as bad.
Yes, that might work. My question is, I've read recently a number of times references mostly to C.S. Lewis, but also to Dorothy Sayers, about their experiences they had with critics, and I mean real vitriol, ad hominem, and so on and so forth. The reason the writers are mentioning them is because that's what we have in spades right now in things like, social media. Don't you see the what they went through is applicable to what's happening now?
I really do, and that's exactly why I think the Wade Center is important. Because polarized discourse is, you're not going to break through just by denouncing each other. You've got to appeal to people's imaginations. And C.S. Lewis made that important comment that George MacDonald baptized his imagination. That was his first step in coming to Christ. His imagination needed to become open to different images of the good. And one of the exciting things about the Wade is we will have people enter here largely because of Tolkien. Because as you know, Tolkien is the father of contemporary fantasy. And we'll have non-Christians enter our doors who probably wouldn't go through doors of a center that's named after Billy Graham because of their prejudices, right? But they will come here and we can have conversations with them about Tolkien to talk about, well, it was his Christian worldview that really explains these amazing characters that you have fallen in love with. And so one of our goals at the Wade is to encourage new acts of creativity that have been inspired by our authors. And one of our more exciting ones is keep this in mind, November 1st, we are sponsoring a Christian ballet troupe that has put together a ballet inspired by the Great Divorce. We saw it in rehearsal, and we actually had someone who knows ballet see it to make sure that the quality was high. So we'll start out that day. David will give a background lecture on Great Divorce for those who are not familiar with it, and then we will see this ballet. We will pray that people who love ballet, who don't know Christ, will cross the threshold to see that. It will be in Edmund Chapel.
And Crystal's agreed to be the lead dancer, so we're very excited about that. We're really looking forward to that. Going back to your question, I think a lot of it has to do with the character behind the dialogue. I think I would say someone who's been cultivated their virtues, they listen with empathy rather than contempt, and they think I might actually learn something from the other point of view, or even to ask, even if I disagree, what took them to this place? What has driven to that point of view? And I think if you can learn to listen with empathy, which someone like Lewis especially could do very well, that can make the dialogue much more fruitful than if you're just bashing against each other in these kind of exchanges, contemptuous remarks.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance has been mentioned a lot
Right.
In relation to this problem.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So I saw a book out in the lobby about J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter. And as a homeschool mom, we went and checked out one of the books so that we could read it as a family, and then wonder how to do commentary on it. And I wonder if you could give a bit of wisdom as to how to translate a very non-Christian writer who really appeals to today's youth, how to make a commentary on that to a young student who is learning and wanting to write himself.
Well, the Wade has a podcast, and We recently interviewed a Wade researcher who teaches a course at his college on Harry Potter, and he has followed her. She has made a proclamation for Christ. And she believes that, like Tolkien, she was very influenced by Tolkien. And she read C.S. Lewis as well, didn't she? And so this researcher was telling us that she sees the trajectory of the Harry Potter novels as endorsing a Christian worldview. Somewhat, I think, the way Tolkien would, because, as you know, some Christians would not allow their children to read Tolkien because there's witches and dwarves and evil characters. But it's cemented in his Christian faith that the idea of sacrifice and the battle between good and evil. Want to add anything?
Yes, I was surprised by that. I thought she was sort of modern humanistic psychology, sort of Oprah-ism, if that's a religion or a philosophy. But having done the research, she said that she consciously held back because she didn't want to be labeled as a Christian fiction writer. She even saw herself as taking Tolkien's idea of the little unimportant people are the ones who often are able to accomplish the quest. At the end, when the Voldemort, they have to gather all these Horcruxes in order to... It's very similar to Sauron. If you destroy the ring, he's put all of his character into the ring. So he claimed that there were quite a bit of plot parallels. And she also said she did 7 novels because in tribute to Lewis's 7 Narnia Chronicles. So I think it may be there, but it's more implicit than explicit. Of course, people say that. People read all of Tolkien and don't realize that he was a devout Catholic. I was telling a group earlier that in terms of biblical literacy, I was just teaching before I came to Wheaton at a secular college. And they would read The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they would say, why do people say it's Christian? I don't understand. And I would say, well, you know, this person has to die because he's betrayed his siblings. But Aslan comes forward, and Aslan dies in his place, and they're also sad, but then Aslan comes back to life. Doesn't that ring a bell? My student said, yeah, it's like Gandalf. And I go, oh, no. So, you know.
But it starts them thinking, right? Sacrificial death, resurrection.
Just on a little, this one? Yeah, just on a little rabbit trail about your comment about the King James. And my feeling is that any effort to make belief more understandable to the common public is a dilution of you know, what is truth. And I am obviously a King James advocate, yeah. And hymns also. And I really feel we see it in the pulpit where, you know, we really, like on Memorial Day, it's rare to have us sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, we don't have to sing I understand that. But we, in our effort to make ourselves more pleasing to those that hear us, my fear is that we would dilute what is necessary in the Scripture.
I agree with you. I don't want to dilute anything in Scripture. But I think that, and Sayers talked a lot about this, that the King James English had become just so normalized because they got it in school, they stopped really thinking about what the words were saying. So the words themselves became idols, as Karl Barth once referenced that the Bible had become the paper pope of Protestantism, where people make an idol of it. But the Bible is a sign to God's truth. God's truth does not change. And as far as I'm concerned, I want to draw as many people to Jesus Christ as possible. And if something like King James English is an impediment for them seeing the truth, I want to get rid of that impediment.
think I would add, Lewis wrote an essay called The Authorized Version about the King James Bible. And he said that too often people, their life becomes compartmentalized. So church, you dress up and wear special clothes for church. And then you go and you read in a special language. And if you're not careful, that creates this feeling of division, my real life and my religious life. And Walter Hooper said he never met anyone like Lewis, that their religious life and their real life were so totally interfused. There wasn't that sense of compartmentalization. So the danger for me might be that archaic and poetic language, it feels like stained glass windows and an uncomfortable tie like the one I'm wearing right now. And so you'd want to make sure that the language still spoke to the parishioners and they didn't think, oh, this is a special thing we do on Sundays, but it doesn't relate to the rest of my life.
I wanted to ask whether Max McLean and his performances, the Screw Tape and the Great Divorce, and then the Tolkien exhibit that's at the Morgan Library right now, are you seeing a resurgence of interest, intellectual interest in the Inklings? Or has it just become popular?
I was talking to an editor at Harper One who does a lot of Lewis's books, and he said Lewis's sales have never been stronger. He said they're stronger now than when Lewis was alive. Part of that, the Tolkien movies, the Narnia movies, Shadowlands, there's a new Tolkien biographic. I think between those two, the interest has never been stronger. Some of our other authors, I think it comes and goes in terms of particular events. A new biography comes out or there's a new movie version. But I know for those two, they've never been stronger than they are right now.
As a fan of the Tales of Narnia and the trilogy, I was wondering, in modern literature, who do you see as a possible successor to C.S. Lewis and Tolkien conveying scriptural truths through fantasy?
I wrote a fantasy novel, and nobody has described me as a successor to C.S. Lewis. So I'm still waiting to receive that. I think there's a book called Peace Like a River by Leif Inger, it's a little bit like C.S. Lewis meets Garrison Keillor. It's set in the American Midwest, but once again, the father is very devout, and he uses King James English when he talks about his spirituality. But it's a fascinating bit of, I called it magical realism, and my students said it's more like spiritual realism. You never know when the spiritual world's going to interpose itself upon everyday life. Also, do you know the Andrew Peterson novels? He's written a series called the Wing Feather Saga, which is really interesting modernization of the Narnia Chronicles. The bad guys are called the Fangs of Dang. I think that's a great name for bad guys. So I think of those two. Do you think of other books that are continuing the legacy? Part of what we would like to do is to make sure that the legacy is continued. We don't want the Wade Center to be a mausoleum. We want it to be a real living center of spiritual renewal and literary interest.
In fact, in one of our speaking engagements in Pennsylvania, we ran into a woman who is writing a play based on Paralandra, and she wants to use that play among adolescents to get them talking and thinking and just doing readings, and she's already done this. So our commitment is to really raise up the next generation of writers who can use imagination that is seeped with their Christian worldview.
My wife and I are struggling as we read The Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength. Would you like to help us understand?
We actually have a series on Monday nights. We're reading That Hideous Strength together with Reverend J. Moses. We're working through that novel. And that does go together with That Hideous Strength. You are quite correct. We're actually initiating a series. We have a book called the Wade Annotated Edition of Pilgrim's Regress. Lewis's first Christian book has a lot of Latin and Greek and German and French and a lot of allusions that people won't get. That was well received, so just this week we decided to start working on an annotated Surprised by Joy, because many of his experiences that he describes in his memoir, people don't understand the context. And then down the road, we're hoping to do an annotated abolition of man. Once again, when you say help you with it, I wonder how much time you would have, because that could be a long discussion. Well, Lewis was fascinating that he would have a body of ideas that he expressed in nonfiction, like Abolition of Man, but then he would express the same thing imaginatively. So he writes a book called Preface to Paradise Lost about Milton, but then he also writes Paralandra, which is kind of a gloss on his own take on Paradise Lost. I think the simplest thing about Abolition of Man, Lewis says in the old days, according to Aristotle, humans have the head, which is the seat of reason. They have the belly, which is the seat of appetites, and those both come naturally. But people also have chest, which is the seat of morals and sentiments and aesthetic judgments. And that doesn't come naturally. You have to be trained to love beauty, to admire goodness, to realize that selfishness is lower than altruism. And the reason he calls them men without chests, is that moderns, they still can reason their way past something, or they can follow their appetites, but they don't have the moral sentiments to guide them to a really fulfilling life. So in many ways, that hideous strength, I think, is his embodiment of the idea of what is it like to live in a world of men without chest. We were talking earlier about how polarized the dialogue is these days in the public, and I think that's part of it right there, is there's not that sense of empathy or moral idealism, or how can we both benefit from a dialogue. And there's kind of a moral vacuum at the center of many of those conversations, I think.
So Lewis was answering the questions of atheists from his own background as an atheist, and he died in '63. Now, you know so much about postmodernism. Those questions are the same today? Are they different questions? He's answering questions that he had as an atheist from perspective of today, way back then. What about the questions that are being asked today? Are they the same, or are they different questions?
So, right, Lewis and Sayers were encountering a type of scientism, this sense that any religious language is pseudo-language. You get that in the new atheism as well. There was a wonderful, one of my books out there is called How Postmodernism Serves My Faith. And essentially, I am arguing that postmodernism is the best thing that happened to Christianity in 300 years. But partly, we have left the postmodern moment behind. And the reason I argue this way, and I quote Sayers, I quote C.S. Lewis, because postmodern theorists were calling into question scientism. They were saying scientists rely on faith as much as Sunday school teachers do. All humans start with faith. And so they were totally subverting this idea that, well, science reaches truth and religion is superstitious. That was kind of the modernist paradigm, and it's what Lewis and Sayers were both battling. Unfortunately, a lot of people didn't understand postmodernism. It's called the religious turn in philosophy because it opened the way to religious discussions. The trouble is, at the height of postmodernism came 9/11. And that was a moment that said, well, this is what happens when you open yourself to other religious people. We were open to them, and they're trying to destroy us. So I still think we can learn a lot from postmodern theorists because they emphasized faith.
I want to go back to the other part of the question. When I read other thinkers like Freud and B.F. Skinner, for example, I'm struck by how dated they are. I feel like I can see how that was important in that generation, but those insights don't continue to carry forward. With Lewis and Sayers, and especially I've been reading Chesterton lately, I'm amazed how timely they are, how pertinent they are. In many ways, Britain got to kind of a post-Christian state about a generation earlier than America. And so they were writing to things that would be familiar with us now, that for them, that was already happening in Europe. I was just reading a Chesterton quote. He says, there's two kinds of people, those who embrace dogma and admit it, and those who embrace dogma and don't admit it. And I said, how relevant is that? I mean, that could have been said today or yesterday. So that's part of the reason we love the Wade authors, is because this ongoing sense of relevance and timeliness.
Speaking of more modern authors, have you considered Peter Kreeft at all?
I know Peter Kreeft. Considered him for my job? What do you?
For reading on equally stimulating philosophical Christian
Right.
world enmeshed topics.
Yes, he's very stimulating.
Some people call him the C.S. Lewis of this century, and I just wondered if you had done some reading. He has fiction and he has dialogues that describe philosophers very easily, very easy to understand, but profound, and he has copious books out there.
Right. He wrote a book. C.S. Lewis and John Kennedy and Aldous Huxley all died on the same day, November 22nd, 1963. And he has a book where the three of them are meeting in some sort of waiting room and comparing their different philosophies. And that's really a fascinating study of how those three what they would have to talk about. Yeah, I love Kreeft's work. He's Roman Catholic, so it's an interesting, he was Reformed who became Roman Catholic. And so he has really interesting perspective in terms of the whole spectrum of Christian denominations. I value his work. Normally, our defining authors tend to be a blend of faith, intellect, and imagination. So I always love it when I see those traits being continuing to be expressed in later generations, someone like Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate all you've shared so far. Probably my favorite book of all the C.S. Lewis books is the compilation God in the Dock, which stresses you mentioned the reason side, in my opinion. He does, and you in your book, The Reluctant Convert, the subtitle, you stress the balance of Lewis, and I'm sure the other six do it to a degree, but he really does the balance of reason and imagination in supreme ways. But I was wondering if you could comment on that. And I'm learning myself so much about the other six. I knew some about it before, but I'm particularly glad that C.S. Lewis is part of the whole book, because he does seem to be epitomizing that balance so well. But if you could speak to that.
It's not my phone, is it? I think the one thing you said that struck me was the balance of intellect and imagination. What's fascinating, for most of his teen years and his 20s, he felt his mind was very split, almost schizophrenic, because his intellect told him that life was meaningless and you were simply a fluke of evolution. But his imagination, he loved myth and legend and children's stories and folk tales. And it was Christianity that allowed him to bring those two together. If the Christian Gospels were actually true myth that actually happened in history, then suddenly mythology takes on a great new meaning. So I love the fact not only that he integrated imagination and intellect, but the fact that it was his Christian faith that allowed him to put those two together. I think in a way it almost saved his sanity. I had a student here at Wheaton who just became a Christian in his early 30s, and he said, I feel like there's so much lost time. I'm already 30 and I'm just now learning about Christianity. And I said, well, you're in pretty good company between St. Paul and Augustine and C.S. Lewis. I think there's quite a bit of time to, be of service to the kingdom in the time you have remaining.
There's one more.
Hopefully this is not a rabbit trail, but in the area of fantasy, would you care to make a comment on The Shack?
My mic is not working. Did you want to take that?
I have to admit I haven't read it because one of my friends said, it's really fascinating, but it's so poorly written, Crystal, it will make you want to scratch your eyeballs out. So I didn't want to do that. I do mention it I have a book called Changing Signs of Truth, because this idea that truth does not change. But Sayers and Lewis taught me that the truth doesn't change, but how do we change our signs that point to the truth? One good example, I got this from David. He went to the University of Colorado at Boulder, and there was a big sign that said, "Keep off the grass." And you could just see all these paths worn into the grass. People totally ignored the sign. And so some smart administrator finally realized we've got to change the sign to communicate to this generation. The truth was the same. They changed the sign and they said, "Give Mother Earth a chance."
Yeah.
Within a semester, all the grass had grown back. So what we see in all the authors here at the Wade is they're ones who are coming up with new signs for the same truth. And that's why, now I'm going back to your question, that's why I mentioned the shack, because a lot of people have benefited from it, because it's new science, but neither of us can comment on it because we haven't read it. Well, we promised people that we would be done by 10 after. Thank you so much. You were fantastic, responsive audience. Please exit the building at the doors right off the lobby. So you go out, turn to your left. The museum and reading room will be open tomorrow, so you could come back tomorrow between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. So we have extended hours for you tomorrow. Thank you for coming.